be sometimes about, you know, harder than just being in love. It's about sacrifice.
New details about Clint Eastwood's son, Scott Eastwood. Scott Eastwood, born on March 21st, 1986, in Monterey, California, is the son of legendary actor and director Clint Eastwood, growing up under the shadow of one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. Scott carved his own path in the film industry. He began acting in the mid-2000s, appearing in small roles before landing more prominent parts in films like The Longest Ride, 2015, Suicide Squad, 2016, and Pacific Rim, Uprising, 2018. Known for his charisma, striking looks, and determination, Scott has established himself as a rising star, balancing his father's legacy with his own distinct career. Scott Eastwood's rocky start, following his initial steps in Hollywood. Scott Eastwood faced a reality far from glamorous, despite being the son of Clint Eastwood, one of the most respected filmmakers in cinema history. Scott's path was anything but easy. He often auditioned for roles in his father's movies, yet was rejected repeatedly, even for Gran Torino, 2008, which became one of Clint's most acclaimed films. While his father collected Oscars and accolades, Scott was pouring drinks as a bartender and parking cars to make ends meet. Ironically, his side jobs earned him more money than his early acting gigs. These rejections pushed him to the brink of giving up. At one point, Scott seriously considered leaving Hollywood behind and becoming a firefighter, craving a career where hard work and courage were valued more than connections or fame. This internal struggle shaped his resilience. What seemed like setbacks were, in fact, the foundation of the determination that would later fuel his rise as an actor. Scott's early hardships remind us that even with a famous last name, true success in Hollywood must be fought for and earned. The secret childhood of Scott Eastwood. After the struggles of his early career, another layer of Scott Eastwood's story lies much deeper, in the shadows of his childhood. Born on March 21st, 1986, Scott was the son of Clint Eastwood and Jocelyn Reeves, a flight attendant who had a brief relationship with the legendary actor. At that time, Clint was still publicly linked to actress Sandra Locke, making Scott's existence the result of a complicated, secretive chapter in his father's personal life. 2 years later, in 1988, Scott's younger sister, Catherine, was born. Yet despite being the children of one of Hollywood's biggest icons, neither Scott nor Catherine was openly acknowledged or raised by Clint during those years. Their mother carried the weight of raising them largely on her own, away from the glamour and protection of Clint's public world. For Scott, childhood was marked not by luxury, but by questions of identity and belonging. He grew up knowing who his father was, yet also feeling the distance of not being fully recognized. This sense of abandonment would later forge his independence and toughness, but it also left scars, reminding him that even in Hollywood dynasties, the line between fame and secrecy is often blurred. A childhood away from the spotlight, following the secrecy of his birth. Scott Eastwood's upbringing was far removed from the glittering lights of Hollywood, raised first in Carmel by the Sea, California, and later in Hawaii. Scott's childhood was intentionally distanced from the public eye to shield him from gossip and scrutiny surrounding Clint Eastwood's complicated personal life. Unlike many celebrity children, Scott grew up in an environment where no one knew his father was one of the most powerful figures in cinema. He lived a modest life, taking on construction jobs, waiting tables, and other part-time work to support himself. This down-to-earth lifestyle not only kept him grounded, but also instilled a strong work ethic. When he attended Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, Scott chose to pay his own way, working to cover tuition fees. He majored in communications while also joining acting classes, quietly pursuing his passion without exploiting his famous surname. In fact, to avoid any form of favoritism, he adopted his mother's last name and went by Scott Reeves during auditions and early roles. These years away from privilege forged his independence and shaped the resilience that would later define his career. Scott's childhood, far from the spotlight, became the very foundation of the man he would become. The hard path to stardom, building on his quiet upbringing and years of independence. Scott Eastwood's path into acting was anything but straightforward. Many might assume that being the son of Clint Eastwood meant automatic access to leading roles. But the reality was very different. Scott frequently auditioned for his father's films, yet faced rejection time and again. Even for American Sniper, 2014, one of Clint's most celebrated later works, Scott was denied a role. His earliest opportunities came in smaller capacities, such as his appearance in Flags of Our Fathers, 2006, a war drama directed by Clint. At that time, Scott performed under the name Scott Reeves, determined not to rely on his father's reputation. Few knew he was Clint Eastwood's son, and the anonymity meant he had to fight for recognition, like any aspiring actor. Outside of his father's projects, Scott ventured into independent cinema, often working on low-budget productions that struggled for visibility. Many of these films were released directly to video, bypassing theaters entirely and drawing little attention from critics or audiences. For Scott, it was a humbling stretch of years, balancing his passion for acting with the frustration of obscurity. Unlike the privileged route many expected him to take, he built his career from the ground up, learning resilience with every rejection and disappointment. The turning point came in 2009, when Scott was cast in Invictus, another Clint Eastwood-directed film centered on Nelson Mandela and the South African rugby team. This time, however, he entered the credits not as Scott Reeves, but as Scott Eastwood, embracing his true identity. It was a symbolic step, no longer hiding behind anonymity. Scott was ready to balance his own hard work with the legacy of his name. Invictus marked the moment when Scott began to transition from a struggling young actor in direct-to-video films to someone with genuine momentum in Hollywood. Still, his road remained challenging, but by revealing who he really was, Scott finally positioned himself for the opportunities that would shape his career in the years to come. Scott Eastwood's career highlights. After stepping out from the shadows of anonymity with Invictus in 2009, Scott Eastwood began to carve out a path defined by determination and versatility. His journey through Hollywood was not an overnight rise, but rather a series of important milestones that slowly pushed his name into the global spotlight. Each role, whether in modest productions or big-budget features, became a stepping stone toward establishing himself as more than just Clint Eastwood's son. One of his earliest breaks came with Texas Chainsaw 3D, 2013, where he appeared under the name Scott Reeves. The role was part of a multi-picture contract that seemed promising, but despite the film's commercial ambition, it did little to elevate his profile. Still, the experience gave Scott valuable exposure to working on genre cinema and reinforced his persistence in pursuing opportunities, even when success seemed elusive. The real shift began with Fury, 2014, David Ayer's gritty World War II drama starring Brad Pitt, Shia LaBeouf, and Logan Lerman. Cast as Sergeant Miles, Scott went through grueling military-style training to authentically portray a soldier. His willingness to endure the same harsh preparation as his co-stars earned him respect from the ensemble and credibility with audiences. For the first time, critics and fans alike began to recognize him not as a famous offspring, but as an actor capable of delivering raw, believable performances. A year later, in 2015, Scott took on a completely different challenge with The Longest Ride, a romantic drama based on Nicholas Sparks' novel, playing Luke Collins, a rodeo cowboy. Scott leaned into the charm and vulnerability of a leading man. What set him apart was his commitment to authenticity. He insisted on performing his own bull riding stunts, adding a level of realism that resonated with audiences. The film may not have been a critical darling, but it showcased Scott's ability to carry a romance on his shoulders. His performance earned him a nomination for Choice Movie, Breakout Star at the Teen Choice Awards, cementing his arrival as a bankable face for younger audiences. The same year, his visibility skyrocketed beyond cinema when he appeared in Taylor Swift's music video, Wildest Dreams. The project was a global sensation, pairing Scott with one of the world's biggest pop stars. While the video stirred controversy over its depiction of an African landscape and colonial-era imagery, Scott's presence as the romantic lead amplified his fame worldwide. Millions who had never seen his films suddenly knew his face, proving the power of crossover exposure between Hollywood and pop music. Together, these milestones defined the early chapter of Scott Eastwood's career, from slasher sequels to war dramas, from romantic films to music videos. Scott demonstrated an ability to adapt and evolve. More importantly, each role reflected his willingness to take risks, embrace challenges, and prove that his name carried more than legacy. It carried hard-earned talent and resilience. Scott Eastwood's journey through loss. After the milestones that began to solidify his career, Scott Eastwood faced a tragedy that left a permanent mark on his life. In 2014, when his acting journey was finally gaining traction, Scott's world was shattered by the sudden death of his girlfriend, Jewel Brangman. The incident was caused by a defective Takata airbag, a global automotive scandal that claimed numerous lives. On that fateful day, Jewel was involved in what should have been a minor car accident. However, when the airbag deployed, its metal inflator exploded, sending shrapnel into her body and causing fatal injuries. She was only 26 years old. For Scott, the loss was devastating. Beyond the grief of losing someone he loved deeply, he struggled with an unbearable sense of guilt. He later admitted that he had lent her the car she was driving, a fact that haunted him in silence for years. While the world saw him continue to work, attend premieres, and smile for cameras, privately, Scott was carrying a wound that words could barely capture. The emotional toll was so immense that he chose to remain silent about it for a long time, locking his pain away as he tried to cope. It wasn't until 2017, 3 years later, that Scott publicly spoke about Jewel's death. In an interview with GQ magazine, he finally opened up about the accident, the defective airbag, and the lingering heartbreak. His words revealed not just the sorrow of losing a partner, but the isolation that comes with grieving in silence. Scott described it as a turning point in his life, one that reshaped his perspective on mortality, responsibility, and resilience. The tragedy connected him to a much larger issue, as the Takata scandal became one of the biggest automotive recalls in history, underscoring the fragility of life and the randomness of loss. For Scott Eastwood, the death of Jewel Brangman remains one of the most profound tragedies of his personal journey. It stripped away the Hollywood glamour and placed him face to face with grief, guilt, and the fragility of existence, more than any role he has played on screen. This chapter of his life revealed the human vulnerability behind the actor. To this day, it stands as both a scar and a silent motivator, a painful reminder of love lost, and the resilience required to carry on. Scott Eastwood and his tangled roots, following the heartbreak of personal tragedy. Scott Eastwood's story cannot be told without examining the complex web of family relationships that has surrounded him since birth. His father, Clint Eastwood, is not only a Hollywood legend, but also the patriarch of a large, unconventional family. Over the course of his life, Clint fathered 8 children with 6 different women, creating a family tree filled with half-siblings scattered across different households and eras. For Scott and his younger sister, Catherine, childhood was markedly different compared to some of their siblings. While others enjoyed more public acknowledgement and the benefits of Clint's success, Scott and Catherine grew up largely away from their father's world. Their upbringing was more modest, overseen primarily by their mother, Jocelyn Reeves, while Clint remained distant. This absence created not only a sense of longing, but also a tangible gap in the opportunities and comforts they had compared to other Eastwood children. The complexity deepened as the siblings grew older. Many of them did not meet each other until adulthood, by which time differences in lifestyle, upbringing, and experiences had already shaped their perspectives. Although they shared the same father, the lack of shared childhoods meant bonds were weaker, and in some cases, strained. Reports over the years have hinted at feelings of jealousy, especially towards Scott and Catherine, who were seen by some as the hidden children. On the other side, Scott himself has admitted to feeling that sense of inequality when he compared his life with that of siblings who had more access to Clint's resources and attention. The Eastwood family dynamic remains an unusual mix of connection and distance. While public appearances occasionally show them together, insiders often describe the reality as more fragmented than it seems. For Scott, navigating these relationships has been a lifelong challenge. He has had to reconcile pride in his father's accomplishments with the complicated truth of growing up on the periphery of that legacy. The contrasts between siblings who basked in Hollywood privilege and those, like Scott, who grew up in relative obscurity have left lasting marks. Ultimately, Scott's family story is as much about resilience as it is about complexity. The fractured ties and undercurrents of jealousy did not break him. Instead, they reinforced his drive to succeed on his own terms. In many ways, the gaps and rivalries in the Eastwood family mirror Scott's larger journey, proving himself not because of his famous last name, but in spite of it. Core lessons from Scott Eastwood. After years of navigating personal loss and family complexities, Scott Eastwood found balance in unexpected ways. One of the most profound influences came from his late friend Paul Walker, who introduced him to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. For Scott, the martial art became more than just physical training. It turned into a therapeutic practice, a way to heal mentally after the heartbreak of losing loved ones. Through jiu-jitsu, he embraced humility, discipline, and emotional control, lessons that stood in sharp contrast to the pressures and temptations of Hollywood fame. These values translated into his career rather than chasing stardom recklessly. Scott took steady steps, building credibility through diverse roles. His appearances in Fast and Furious, Pacific Rim, Uprising, and The Outpost highlighted his growth as an actor willing to push himself both physically and emotionally. Working alongside icons like Sylvester Stallone further shaped his outlook, teaching him that endurance and humility matter more than ego. For Scott Eastwood, life is less about privilege and more about persistence. His journey reflects a man who has turned tragedy into strength, fame into responsibility, and adversity into resilience. The lessons he has drawn, humility, discipline, and self-control, have become the compass guiding both his personal life and his Hollywood career. Crafting his own path, building on the values of discipline and resilience. Scott Eastwood has also ventured beyond acting to explore entrepreneurship. He co-founded Made Here brand, a clothing line that emphasizes products manufactured entirely in the United States, reflecting his commitment to authenticity and supporting local craftsmanship. This step highlighted a different side of Scott, not just an actor, but a businessman determined to create impact outside Hollywood. By the age of 35, Scott even admitted he had considered leaving acting altogether to pursue his earlier dream of becoming a firefighter, drawn to a career rooted in service and courage. At the same time, he has expressed a deep desire to start his own family, though he remains cautious, knowing the unpredictable nature of life in the film industry. His reflections reveal a man constantly balancing fame with personal purpose, and ambition with humility. Looking ahead, Scott Eastwood envisions a life defined not only by movies, but by meaningful choices, both as an entrepreneur and as an individual seeking stability and fulfillment. After exploring Scott Eastwood's journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring Hollywood stories.